Hello, everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to the Digital Empowerment Project, Module 10, on digitizing 3D collections in museums. The Digital Empowerment Project is a nationwide initiative organized by the 6 U.S. regional museum associations dedicated to providing free, self-paced training resources focused on digital media and technology for small museums. This series of online webinars and toolkits is made possible by funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And we're delighted to have you with us here today. My name is Dan Yeager, and I'm the Executive Director of the New England Museum Association and your host for this final module of the series. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the places in which we gather. In this era of virtual meetings, when digital spaces may substitute our physical sense of place, it's important to reflect on the land we each occupy and honor the indigenous people who have called it home. I'm speaking to you from Swampscott, Massachusetts, north of Boston, the historical homelands of the Massachusetts peoples. Wherever we are, let us acknowledge all indigenous nations as living communities, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. We, the Digital Empowerment Project team, recognize that our organizations and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society that perpetuated the exclusions and erasures of many Native peoples throughout the United States and beyond. We ask you to reflect on the place where you reside and work, and to respect the diversity of cultures and experiences that form the richness of our world and our profession. Thank you. And now for just a few housekeeping notes before we introduce today's presenter. First, I'd like to acknowledge today's ASL interpreter will be on the left side of your screen, and let you know that captioning for today's program is embedded in a box just below the YouTube player on our website with controls to adjust your experience. Following today's program, we ask that you complete a short survey to give us feedback. We'll drop a link to the survey in the chat stream and email a link to those of you who pre-registered. We'd greatly appreciate it if you'd share your experience with us and help us improve our work. We encourage you to post questions to our presenter today, which will be addressed at the end of the program after the presentation. Please type your questions in the chat. We'll get to as many questions as time allows. However, we may not be able to address all questions during the live session, and so for this reason, we've set up an online community forum for raising questions, posing answers, and connecting with your fellow museum practitioners on the Museum Learning Hub website, which you can find at museum-hub.org. If you're looking for help between programs, please visit this forum, create a login and post your questions, and a member of the community will get back to you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker for our second Module 10 Tech Workshop, Image-Based Approaches to Documenting 3D Collections. Carla Schroer is co-founder and director of Cultural Heritage Imaging, a nonprofit corporation based in San Francisco that develops and implements imaging technologies for cultural, historic, and artistic heritage and scientific research. Carla leads the training programs at CHI, along with working on field capture projects with reflectance transformation imaging and photogrammetry. She also leads CHI's software development activities. Carla spent 20 years in the commercial software industry, managing and directing a wide range of software development projects. Carla, thanks for being with us.
Presentation today, but is not able to join us due to a health issue. And also my colleague Mark Mudge, because the work I'm presenting is really the work of all of us. I want to start by saying that I'm here in San Francisco, California, the traditional home of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, and we pay our respects to them, their elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. Cultural Heritage Imaging is a nonprofit corporation, and we believe that the treasures of humanity are worth saving. We were founded, we're in our 20th year now. And really, the big idea of our work, which fits directly with what I'm going to be talking about today, is about the ideas around how digital cultural heritage can be documented, and that the tools that are available for this are widely adopted around the world by cultural heritage practitioners, museums, libraries, historic sites, archaeologists, and so forth, but also by cultural communities directly and by citizen scholars. And we really believe that cultural communities should be able to take control of their own documentation needs and therefore their own cultural narrative. We really believe that information that's widely sourced helps everybody, and it creates a better world of knowledge, that information is coming from lots of places and not just a small number of wealthy institutions. And that when we're doing digitization and documentation work, that we have to think beyond our immediate needs of what we might be using it for today, but also how are we going to archive and preserve that digital information to make it available for others to use and reuse for novel purposes. And I'll be talking about some approaches that we take to that last part as we go through today. So I want to start, because I know this is first really targeted at small museums, with some ideas for very, very simple and low cost things that can be done to deal with spaces and 3D objects. And the simplest and most inexpensive thing would be various approaches that use a series of images that are just stitched together. In this case, there is no geometry. And what I mean by that is that there's no coordinate system. There's no X, Y, Z position in space. They're just a set of images and software that understands the relationship of the images so you can kind of move around. Let me show you a couple of examples. I think we've all seen panoramas. Here's one in San Francisco that I just found on the web. I didn't make this one. We can kind of spin around and get a feel for where we are. You can see that there are some distortion and perspective issues as I move around here, and that's because there's no geometry. There's only the images. Another option is we can turn this sort of in on itself, and we can put an object on a turntable and take some pictures, and then we can spin it around and zoom in and out. And for some reason that decided not to zoom. So this is a really, really simple way, if you have a 3D object, to be able to share the object and let people sort of see the backside of it and so forth, particularly in a collection space maybe where they could never see that. This is a simple case of just a single pass on a turntable. You have a camera and a turntable and you take a set of images. There are more complex ways to do this, what we call sort of a multi-row object movie. These are often called object movies. So in this case, I can actually turn the object all the way around. But again, these are just images that have a relationship to each other. There's no actual 3D, there's no geometry. And what that means is that I can't measure it, and there's some other limitations to what I can do. But as a visualization, as a way to easily just share some information, this could be a useful tool. So the advantages here, they're inexpensive. There's lots of different software packages that can put these kinds of things together, and you can convey more information than you can from a single photo. The disadvantages are that there are distortion and perspective issues. You don't have any geometry, as I've said, and that means you can't measure things. You have no accurate measurement. And also, some of the tools produce proprietary formats, so that would make it difficult in terms of the longevity of the data and the archiving of the data. So what I want to spend most of the time today talking about is the area where our organization works, which is called computational photography. And what we mean by that is that we're taking a sequence of images and we're using computer algorithms to extract information across that sequence of images and generating new forms of digital representations that are not possible from a single picture by themselves, and they contain additional information. So there's a large family of things that are considered computational photography. The ones that we focus on and that I'm going to be presenting today are reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, and photogrammetry. So let me start with an RTI, and I think the easiest thing is for me to just give you an example. So this is a Greek kylix from the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum. And in the picture there is Sanchita Balachandran, and she is an archaeologist and also a conservator. So I'm gonna zoom in here so we can see some details. Now, with an RTI, what we have is both shape and color information, but we have that only from a single camera point of view. So we can't spin the object around, but from that single camera point of view, we can relight from any direction, and we can also employ mathematical enhancements that allow us to see details that we can't see with the naked eye. And this can be really, really valuable for looking at fine surface details, inscriptions, and so forth. In this case, Sanchita's project is was very interested in the original designs on these Greek pieces that were painted in with slip before they would have then been painted over. And she could see under the microscope evidence of these original drawings, but under the microscope, she was seeing such a small area that she really couldn't put together the whole thing. So right here, you can see along the back here that the figure was drawn in, even though it's likely that the design always was intended to include the shield, the back of the figure was drawn in. And by doing the RTI and applying this mathematical enhancement, and here I'm looking at shape with no color, because our eye tends to follow color, making it harder to see things, we can see elements of the original design, including in the garment here and along the arm and so forth. So what's happening with an RTI is we have a camera in a fixed position, we have our subject in a fixed position, and we take a sequence of images with light in different known positions around the subject. And then in software, we can synthesize that into an RTI, and special viewing environments know how to then do the relighting and do the mathematical enhancements. So it's a 2D image, it's pixel-based, but it contains 3D information about the surface shape. This is based on work that came out of HP Labs more than 20 years ago now, in 2001, by Tom Malsbender and Dan Gell. It can be actually quite inexpensive in terms of equipment to do this. We can use a regular camera and a tripod. We figure out the light position based on a reflection on a reflective sphere that we can put in the image, and there's software that can figure that out. So here is a basic example of an RTI setup. I have the camera pointing down. We're actually firing the camera from a computer, but there are various ways to fire the camera. This is my colleague Marlin, who's holding a string to keep my distance the same. And then I take different images with light in different positions around the subject. So it can be pretty straightforward to do, and the software is also open source. Here's a setup for a vertical subject, and the main thing is we have to get spheres into the image. Here's in a gallery. In this case, we're just shooting the small area of this panel right here, and we put the light, the flash, on a pole so that we can get it up higher to get it around the subject. A couple more quick examples. This is from the Smithsonian Natural History Museum collection. It's a Mississippian culture chipped mace. This is from the RTI. We can start to see the edge. And when I look at this mathematical enhancement, you can see that all of the details of that surface, all the touches and retouches there can be viewed, which can be really, really helpful for researchers, but also for people that just want to understand how these things were made. Here's another example of a Japanese woodblock print from the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And here in this image that came out of the RTI, I've got the color at the bottom, and then here is, again, with no color and just the surface shape, and we can see all of the details of the embossing and of the design that was in the woodblock. This technique is really flexible. We can do it on fairly large subjects. This is an inscription that we shot at the El Morro National Monument. And in this case, the area we're shooting is about 1.5 meters wide. You can see we're using a little bit larger light in that case, and the string is on a stick so that we can control it. here are a couple of images from that RTI where we had both Native American rock art and an inscription from 1606 from Onate in this same location. And so here's some information that we can see from the RTI. But we can, on the other end, we can take this all the way down under a microscope. So we can look at very, very small subjects. So here we are back with Sanchita at Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, and we imaged this very, very small intaglio gem. It's a little over a centimeter tall, a little less than a centimeter wide. And here are some images from the RTI. You can see as we move the light, we're bringing out different details like the sculptural elements in the hair, and here where we're bringing out details in the hand. So this is a great technique that can help you if you're trying to analyze a surface, if you're trying to show fine surface details. Conservators use this quite a bit. The software is free. It's available from our website along with instructional videos and so forth. Now I want to talk a little bit about photogrammetry. For photogrammetry, our goal is to create a 3D digital surface, digital object that replicates our actual subject as close as we can in shape and color. We also, going back to this archiving idea, want to be thinking about how we're creating our photographic image sets. We want them to be independent of the specific software we're using. We want to follow good photogrammetric practices so that that set of images could be reused by somebody else and could be understood by somebody else. It can also be preserved for future generations. And we want, if we follow good practice, our data can be qualitatively and quantitatively evaluated. So I want to show you a couple examples of this. And the examples that I'm showing are all directly from the photogrammetry software. In a couple cases here, I'm going to be showing you that in photogrammetry software. But we did not do any smoothing or hole filling or hand editing. And it's important to understand that frequently when you see 3D models presented, a lot of work has been done to them before you see them. And so if you just want to understand the subject or have the enjoyment of the subject, that's perfectly fine. But if you want to use that data for research or for conservation or tracking change or so forth, then you really need to understand what's been done to the data so that you can use it correctly. So my first example is a replica Olmec head that's here in San Francisco at City College. We imaged it as part of a photogrammetry training class. And you can see there's a tree right here that limits our ability to get all the way around the subject. But let's go look at the model. This is a dense cloud, which means it's a point cloud, which means it's a set of points in space. Each point has a coordinate, an X, Y, Z position in space, and a color associated with it. And in this case, I have 68 million points in this model, okay? And in the photogrammetry software, we can turn on the cameras. So what I'm seeing now is every blue rectangle here is showing the position of a camera that was used to shoot this. This is a training class. We had a lot of people. There were some overlaps. This is a little bit overshot. It's 225 images. Probably could be done with a little bit less and still get, the same quality. And then note around the top here, there's a place where the images are up high and then they kind of drop down right here. That's because of that tree. We couldn't get the camera over here, but we still got a really good result. I'm going to turn the cameras off now. So this is my point cloud, my dense cloud. And from that, we can create a wireframe or a mesh. In this case, the mesh is so big that I have to zoom in pretty far for you to see the triangles. But basically, the mesh is, I'm trying to show you the eye here. So there are more triangles in the areas where I have a swift change in surface and less in smoother areas. And we can take those triangles and turn them to solid. It's easier to kind of see the surface that way. And the thing about doing photogrammetry, particularly if it's done properly, and I have used calibrated scale bars in the scene. I can measure. So I can see, for example, how deep is this eye? How far is it from here to here? And I can measure, this is 2.9 centimeters. So I can rotate this around. I can measure any aspect of the surface that might be interesting to me. So that can be super valuable. Like across the eye here is 48 centimeters. The other thing is I can show this with pictures on it, the texture map. And so the thing is that when you see 3D models presented, almost all of the time, what you're looking at is a model that has a texture map on it. Even if the model was created from a laser scanner, there are photos generally taken with a camera. Sometimes there are other methods for getting the surface. And then that texture map is laid over the top of the geometry. And so the texture map can hide a lot of problems in the actual geometry. It has the virtue of I can scale down the geometry, have much less actual geometry, put the pictures on it, and then it looks really good and carries a lot of detail. But I may not have enough actual measurable geometry for whatever my purposes are. And so the point there is really that whenever you're doing imaging, whenever you're doing documentation, you really need to ask yourself, why am I doing this? Who is it for? Who is going to use this data? And what information is important to them? Because if you don't understand that, you can't choose the right methodology and you can't produce the right kinds of results. In fact, we go so far as to say, if you can't answer those questions, you shouldn't be doing it. You should go back and figure out why you're doing it. So I just want to point that out when you start to look at 3D data, that you may be seeing massage data, you may be seeing data that's covering up problems, and you may not. And so learning to sort of understand what you're seeing and how to ask the right questions is a good skill to have. The next example I want to show you is from the Library of Congress. This was also a photogrammetry training that we did there shortly before everything shut down. This is a 12th century Romanesque binding. And here I am back in the photogrammetry software, and you can see I can rotate this all the way around. Let me back out and show you the cameras, the pictures. What we did in this case is we took, we put it on a turntable, and we shot it all the way around, and we turned it over, shot it all the way around, and then we took some extra pictures up over the top. These were handheld, so that we got the whole subject, and we can put that together in the software. Turn the cameras off. So here's the front of the book, and same thing. Like I can measure in this. This is the point cloud. In this case, I have 19 million points. But this is all measurable. So if I wanted to go, for example, to the solid model and say, you know, how big is one of these little punch lines here, I can measure that from here to here. And in this case, it's 6.72 millimeters. So the closer in I am on the surface, the more detail I have, which also means, I mean, the higher precision I get in my measurements, which means I have to understand the precision of the model, not just the resolution of the model. The resolution is how many points do I have, just like the resolution of a photograph. But when we start doing these digital representations, in addition to the resolution, we also need to understand the precision. And the precision is the question of whether or not the things are in the right place. I can have a very high resolution model that has a lot of noise or bumps on the surface, and the points are not in the right place. So understanding both the precision and the resolution of the model, or of the needs of your audience, who you're doing it for, is going to help you approach this the right way and apply the right techniques. Okay. You can do photogrammetry actually without a lot of equipment. So if I was working outdoors, the thing I would need, we really recommend a digital SLR, because to do this properly, you have to lock everything down. Yes, you can do it with a phone. There's some apps to do it, but you're not going to get the same kind of precisions that you would get with a digital SLR. These are calibrated scale bars, and this is a monopod. And with just that set of equipment, we're also using a wide angle lens here. With just this set of equipment, we can do rock art, the Olmec head, things like that. If we're working indoors in a studio environment, we would also need some lighting to light our subject, but it can be done without a lot of equipment. In order to get the kind of high quality results that I've been talking about, we really need to follow a set of rules about how the images are collected, how our camera is set up. If we do that, that's going to allow us to get very high precision, low uncertainty data for the results that we can actually quantify and talk about. So if we follow that set of rules, we can get 3D and actually correct, perspective corrected 2D outputs. We can quantify the measurement, and we can create repeatable, reliable images that can be preserved for others to use and to reproduce our work. Sometimes when we go out in the world and to conferences and things, we hear people give the advice that you just take a lot of pictures. Take a lot of pictures, the software's so good, you just throw the pictures in the software and you get this 3D model. Look, isn't it great? And it's true. You can take a lot of pictures and you can get something that looks good. And maybe that's okay, depending on what your purpose is. But if you do this, your results can have significant and unknowable embedded measurement error. We cannot figure out what the error is. It's no longer quantifiable. So if you just take a lot of pictures, then that data may be appropriate to make something that spins around on your website or that can be grossly measured. But if you really want to use the data for tracking change, for conservation activity before and after, for research purposes, then you probably shouldn't apply that approach. And so you really need to follow the set of rules so that you're getting high quality data. I want to show one more example of 3D, and in this case, it's over here in my browser. So this is a model that we created, and it's I'm showing it to you in Sketchfab. Sketchfab is essentially YouTube for 3D models. Anybody can put 3D models there, and you can see all kinds of models, from things that people completely made up out of their heads to things that are empirically captured like this, to everything in between. So there's lots of dragons and bugs and robots, and there are also museums and so forth that have things there. This is kind of a fun project because this trunk was found in the Netherlands, and it's I'm trying to remember the date now. Whoops, sorry, but it's at least a couple hundred years old, and it contained locked letters, undelivered letters, and so there's a whole research team that's been working on it. There's a website around it. And we were in the Netherlands for a conference, and we were asked to come and image this to add to the work that they're doing. It's on display in a museum in The Hague. So we went and we shot it, and we got good measurable data all the way around. And in this case, we also did some additional imaging. So we didn't do 3D in the inside because we had essentially one day to get as much done as we could. We had to bring all of our own equipment and so forth. So we just took photographs of the rest of it to help document it. We did a couple of RTIs of some of the wax seals that were on it, and also just some good close-up macro photography of that. So the reason I included this example is it's a case where we did multiple techniques to really capture all of the information that was of interest to the folks we were working with, and that fit the time and budget that we had. We had one day on site in the museum to shoot it. The 3D model was the highest priority. We did that first, and then we did some additional documentation. So you can mix and match these techniques to meet your needs. We have some resources on our website, and some of the rules that I was talking about before, the rule-based imaging, there are instructional videos, as well as some write-ups of that on our photogrammetry page. The capture methodology is independent of the software. So it doesn't matter what software you're going to use. If you follow good photogrammetric practice, you'll get a good set of images that can work in a variety of software packages. The software we use at this point is commercial software. We currently use Agisoft Metashape Pro. There are open source efforts in this area. At this point in time, we don't think they're quite ready, but in the next 3 to 5 years, we think there's going to be more and more available in that space. So now I want to take a minute and talk about what do we mean when we say scientific imaging, what makes data reliable and reusable, how do we think about that reuse and longevity of our data and not just having cool things spinning around on our websites. So first, let's just talk about the scientific method for a moment. At its core, the scientific method is really about a couple of things. One is that the original data, you have to have empirical data. That original data has to be available for other people to look at and inspect. In our case, we're talking about images. And if we're producing a 3D model, an RTI, a multispectral output, we have to keep track of what we did, and we have to share with people how we process that data in order to show the result. In other words, we can't just show the result, we have to show how we got there. And that's what enables people to review our work, to replicate our work, and so forth. So this core idea is really what's behind the digital lab notebook software that we've been working on for a long time. The 1.0 release is coming out in the next few weeks, and this is open source software that has had some NEH funding. So the digital lab notebook is a toolkit for collecting and managing metadata about computational photography-based imaging. And we're testing right now, release candidate, and we expect the release to be out in the next 2 or 3 weeks. We are very fortunate in that we've had funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities to do the most recent work on the tool, though over time we've had a variety of prototypes and use cases and user input to help us get here. The core design principles here, one, open source was critical because we wanted wide adoption and we wanted people to be able to add to the software. We wanted it to be easy to use and just follow sort of natural language use and the way that you would enter information in a database. We're photographers at the end of the day, so we really wanted to not have to spend all of our time doing metadata. Part of why metadata is not generally done very well is because it takes a lot of time and people don't like to do it. And so the idea is that you enter information once and we make it really easy to reuse the data so that you can start creating templates and so forth of your usual practices. And it makes it very, very easy to collect information as you go. It's a flexible system, so you can enter as much or as little information as you like. It's not yet translated to other languages, but the software itself is internationalized so that it can be translated. What we produce in terms of metadata from the software is something called linked data or linked open data that is mapped to the SciDoc conceptual reference model, also known as the SciDoc CRM, which is a semantic ontology. And here's what's really cool. You don't have to know anything about what I just said in order to use the software. It does this for you completely under the hood. And this is the direction that metadata is really going, particularly in Europe. The Getty has projects in this area. Mellon has been funding projects in this area. Library of Congress is starting to look at it. So in the US, we don't see as much adoption of the CRM mapped linked data. We do see a lot of linked data. And so we expect this to be a direction that continues to pick up. But the system will also produce a Dublin Core record, a Lido record, and a human readable report. So you still have useful information even if your organization is not yet doing the linked data. The other thing is we can enter a lot of the information before we do the image capture or the image processing. So we can kind of create these templates, kits of equipment, stuff like that, that makes it really, really easy when we're actually doing the imaging. And finally, in the new tool, in the 1.0 version, we have something called the archiver that will automatically create a submission information packet or a SIP in a couple of formats, METS or BAGIT. And what that does is it takes all of my images, my results, my work products, my metadata, it wraps them up into a zip file, it puts in a manifest, it puts in MD5 checksums, so I can hand this to a repository and they have the ability to manage this data for the long term, which is really, really huge because tons of the kinds of things I've been showing you are being produced all over the place. And the librarians of the world are really freaking out, the digital librarians of the world are freaking out about what to do with all this data and how to manage it because, especially for research purposes, they really have to understand the data for it to be valuable. So again, the DLN is really about how we collect and manage data about digital representations through their whole life cycle. We support right now RTI, photogrammetry, multispectral imaging, and documentary image sets. And in that category of documentary image sets could be panoramas, object movies, focal stacked images, or just images that document something. So the system itself is really set up around the idea of photo sets, but it's very, very flexible within that environment. Why does this matter? Well, in addition to just creating data that's preservable, we think there's another key reason why this is so important, which is the idea of democratizing technology. And what we mean by that is really enabling anyone that has the skills to collect documentation to contribute their work to the world's knowledge. And what we see today is that so many people rely on the authority of who produced the data rather than the reliability or authenticity of the data itself. And we see that in the terms of, oh, I can trust this data because it came from the Smithsonian, the British Museum, MIT, pick your favorite world-class institution. As opposed to, I can trust this data because I can inspect the data and I can understand the data and the data can speak for itself. And so good data is good data, not so great data is not so great data, and I can figure that out by looking at the data rather than who it came from. And we think that by doing that, it really, really allows anybody to produce high quality work and let that work stand toe-to-toe with the work from the most authoritative sources. We've had a lot of folks involved in the project. Our primary partner for this NEH grant is the Center for Cultural Informatics at the Institute of Computer Science in Heraklion, Crete. And we've had little bits of funding from various sources really over 10 years that we've been working on ideas that became this software. I want to show you a quick example to maybe drive home why this kind of information is so important. If somebody gives me a photograph, just a photograph, and I want to use it for research, what do I need to know about that photograph in order to rely on it for my work? Well, it'd be great if I had the original photo, if I had the camera data, what the settings were in the camera, assuming that the person shot raw and converted it, what were those conversions, and how was the data processed? Especially if I want to measure something. Was distortion correction applied? Was there exposure compensation? And I think a key one is sharpening. So let's take that sharpening example a little bit further. Here's a detail of a Diego Rivera mural called Pan American Unity. And this is straight out of the camera. Here's a little bit of sharpening, and here's a lot of sharpening. And you can't see that. And that's kind of my point, is that this could happen and you might not notice it. So if I zoom way in here and I apply a little bit of sharpening and now a lot of sharpening, hopefully you can see that. So a little bit, a lot. And what's happening is the sharpening is actually changing the pixels. So I can create artifacts on the surface that don't actually exist on the real world subject. And this is just one photograph. If I'm building an RTI, then the software is actually looking pixel by pixel across that stack of images to calculate the RTI data. If I'm doing photogrammetry, the software is actually working on a sub-pixel level to understand how everything aligns and works correctly. If I have sharpened the images, I can produce artifacts on the 3D surface that don't exist in the real world, that could really confuse a researcher trying to use the data, make them think an inscription is there that isn't, or something like that. So understanding the data, where it came from, and how it was created is a critical part of doing documentation if you care about longevity, research, and reuse. My last example that I want to close with is a Maori canoe sail that is at the British Museum. And there's a research project that is happening out of New Zealand by a group of Maori weaving experts and researchers. It's funded by the Marsden Fund. And we were asked to come to London to the British Museum. We worked with a couple of the weaving experts, the Maori researchers, and we did very, very high resolution photogrammetry of the whole sail, both sides. And also we did some RTIs of some small details. So this is just an example of kind of setting it up to shoot it. And we produced a 3.5 billion point model of each side of the sail. And this is part of why I want to bring this up too, is this is an example of why it really helps to understand who you're doing the work for and what they need to know. The researchers who are weavers really wanted to understand how the weaving was done. This particular sail is over 200 years old. It's the only known example of this type of sail that exists in the world. And it's made, I think you can probably see it here. It has 13 panels that are joined together. And it has this series of holes that are in it, and the holes are carried through the joins. And this is a lost way of weaving that they're trying to understand and be able to recreate. So our imaging needed to have enough detail to show them exactly where the strands are going through the whole sail. Here's another area of it. What this also does is give us an incredible conservation record of the state the sail was in at this moment in time. We can see how some of the strands are beginning to fray, and there's even been a little bit of conservation in certain areas. But what we produced allowed the research team to then zoom in and out and look at every strand of this sail and carry it through and see how the weaving was done. This is an image from the RTI. So in addition to doing photogrammetry of the whole sail, both sides, we also, the weavers chose certain areas and asked us to do RTIs of those smaller areas so that we had additional information there. Here you can see through one of these joins how the strands are coming through. You can also see why we had to do it on each side, front and back, because it looks different on the sail as we bring it through. So understanding your audience, understanding why you're doing it, what kind of information do people need, that's going to help you understand exactly what the right approach is. And obviously you have to meet your budget and so forth. And there are many, many tools for you to choose from. So I want to end there. Here are some ways that you can find us and get in touch with us. I want to note that we also run a forum site, Chi Forums, for people that are adopting reflectance transformation imaging and photogrammetry, and actually the digital lab notebook. There's separate forums there for people to ask and answer questions. So that's a good place to go if the original materials don't get you far enough in your work. And finally, here is my contact information and Marlin's as well, and the website of our organization. Thank you.
Thank you. It was terrific. Very interesting, and wow, what great examples. So we have a few questions here from our chat, and just to remind everybody that's on, we have a few minutes for Q&A, so drop your questions in the chat and I will relay them to Carla. One of the questions that we have is regarding the digital lab notebook that you just mentioned. Can you give us an example of an organization that uses the digital lab notebook right now along with their other their technologies, and in what ways have they found it useful, actually, both internally and for the public? And it might be just following up on that last example, like who's using those examples that you've shown, and does the public tune into that, or is it primarily a research academic tool?
Yeah, so in terms of let's start with the DLN specifically. So that we are about to release 1.0. So we're in, even though we've worked on it and the ideas for it for a long time, we had some early prototypes. We did a beta version of tools, or early version of the tools, a couple of years ago. So we're about to release 1.0. So we have had a number of advisors that have used it for some pilot projects, but it isn't really being used at scale at this point. But we hope, obviously, that picks up once we make it available. University of Texas at Austin in archaeology has applied it to documentation that they did on site of a dig last summer. There's a group at Indianapolis that's used it, and we've worked quite a bit with the Smithsonian digitization team, and they've provided a lot of feedback on the tool. They haven't adopted it directly yet, but they've been looking at it. You asked sort of a broader question about the documentation in general, and it really varies. So our organization focuses a lot on training and consulting and helping people adopt the tools for themselves. And there are all kinds of reasons why people want to do this stuff. So some of the material is absolutely being shared and is public. Some of it is for research, and maybe there's a goal to publish it later, or low res versions are published and the high res isn't available. So it really varies.
And so the project the notebook, once it's then actually underway, that's open to anybody. And how do they access that? Is that through you or Smithsonian, or multiple points? Right.
It's open source software. It's free. There will be a GitHub site for folks that want to work on the source code, which is probably not people that are listening to this talk. And then the executables that are ready to run and has an installer and everything will be on our website. We have a downloads area of our website, so culturalheritageimaging.org/downloads, and you can find the RTI software, info on photogrammetry stuff. And right now the beta of the DLN is up, so wait a couple of weeks and the real 1.01 will be available. There are links for instructional videos, user guides, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, cool. And relevant to that, one of the questions, our team is wondering if there are tutorials or guides for getting started with photogrammetry on your website or elsewhere. So I suspect the answer is yes, and the question about the notebook as well, eventually.
I'm sorry, I had a little blip in my audio there and I didn't catch the whole question.
Yeah, so the question is just the subject of tutorials and guides and so forth on photogrammetry specifically, and that's on your website?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and I have a document that I'll provide to you guys that we can put in your forums as well that has just links for different kinds of resources. So we have a technology area of our website. And in the photogrammetry page, there is a description of some of the stuff that I've talked about, and then there are links out to instructional videos on photogrammetry capture. So we have a Vimeo channel for photogrammetry, and we have a Vimeo channel for DLN. It's all linked out from our website, and the user guides and stuff are there as are linked as well.
Questions here is a great one. What kinds of projects should smaller museums undertake, and when should they think about doing it out of house, outsourcing it? So, in-house versus out of house. And I saw that you go to museums a lot to do this work, but what kinds of things could we do just on our own?
Well, I mean, really, you can do all of it on your own, but you have to invest a little bit in some equipment, and then you also it's some time in learning to do it. So that's going to vary across museums, whether there's staff that's appropriate to do that. And I realize for small museums that can be a lot harder. We did a NEH sponsored training program a few years ago where we specifically targeted smaller museums, and we held out a certain number of these were in-person trainings. And we held out a number of seats for people from small museums. And a lot of the ones that came were small museums that were in universities. So they tended to have access to a little bit more equipment and things to make things work. So I think it really, again, it goes back to your purpose. Why are you doing it? Who is it for? Are just some good photographs good enough? Is a spinning object movie good enough for your purpose of sharing some important object or telling a story? I mean, museums are often trying to tell stories. How do I illustrate my story? And so there are some very inexpensive ways you can do that. Sometimes you have a really special object. Maybe you can get a grant to do research on it, like the sale that we were invited to do. That team of people is not going to learn to do this kind of imaging. It's not appropriate. They had a research question in a research project. They got a research grant, and then they paid us to come image it. So I would say, those are some of the trade-offs. I think, it comes up a lot. Can I do this with my phone? And the cameras and phones are getting better and better. There's no doubt about that. It goes back to fit for purpose. Why am I doing it? Who is it for? Some pictures I shot with my phone may be good enough. There are apps you can put on your phone that make little 3D models. Now, they're not going to be measurable. They're going to have noise and issues. They're not going to be super tight like the stuff that I just showed you. Maybe that's okay. It goes back to who you're doing it for and why you're doing it, whether or not that kind of approach gets what you need. If it's really about making people aware of what's in your museum and helping tell stories about objects in your collection, then you may not need these, scientific types of results. So that's discussion that you should be having about who you're doing it for and why. I think the biggest mistake that we see people make, and this often comes not from the staff, but higher up in museums, this idea that, especially the bigger museums, we have to have a 3D strategy and go make 3D, and then it's going to, it's going to meet all these needs. I'm going to have a cool thing for my website, and I'm going to meet research and conservation needs and so forth. Well, not necessarily, right? It's going to depend on your budget and your approach. So I think it's a mistake to think that there's one thing that you can do that's going to meet all of the needs. So really understanding your goals there is going to help you make the right choices. And obviously then, the budget and the amount of time that it takes are dependent on those choices.
What drives the budget? There is one question here about the number of images that you need reasonably to make sure that, the complexity of the object is taken care of. I'm sure that drives it. Is the size of an object also at play here and the relative ease of photographing it and the like?
It totally varies. So it depends on the level of resolution that you need, and it depends on the complexity of the object, not the size so much. So if I have a sculpture, an Asian sculpture that has 8 arms, and I have to get around all of those arms and get detail in them, that's going to take way more time and way more photos than if I have something, shaped more like the Olmec head, where I can just go get around it and I'm going to have all the detail that I need. So size is one factor, but the needed resolution, the needed precision, and also the complexity of the object are going to impact that. For something like, like say an Asian sculpture with a lot of arms, maybe just an object movie makes sense. Now somebody can spin it around, they can zoom in and out, they get a sense of what this object is. Particularly, we see museums a lot where they're like, this is always on display where nobody can ever see the backside of it. And so something even as simple as an object movie can help people, see that kind of a result. If you're talking about RTI, we're doing between 35 and 50 images per RTI, and that's a single camera point of view. So RTI will get used primarily for situations where we need to see really fine surface details. So something like a faded inscription, trying to read a signature that's very hard to read, before and after treatment for conservation. Rock art is a great example. So there are a variety of reasons why RTI is a great solution, and we're talking 35 to 50 images for each RTI. So each camera position, that's what we're shooting.
And one of my questions, these file sizes must be humongous.
It varies, and I think part of it is, get over it. Space is cheap. And I get
the equipment though, right? I mean, ultimately you have to make sure you have enough computation power to be able to handle it.
Yeah, so the RTIs really don't take a lot of compute power, and the things like the object movies and stuff I showed at the beginning don't take a lot of compute power. the 3D work to do the kind of high-res stuff that I'm showing does take more computer power. There are places where there's services that you can have build, you shoot the images and they can do the processing on bigger systems. So that's a possibility. You probably want to be able to do some initial work yourself just to get a feel for it. So there are ways to get it done. The costs are coming down on a lot of that kind of work. So, but yeah, from an archiving perspective, you can produce a large set of images that have a fairly big footprint. But I mean, and we've worked with various library groups. We've had partners on certain projects where there's a longevity of the data, and we want them to be the archive for a project. And so we like paid a fee to deposit stuff with them, or maybe they'll show certain things for free, and the costs of that keep coming down.
Put on your futurist hat here, and where do you see this field going in the technology? Like, what's on the horizon? There's a question here about utilizing LiDAR drone imaging technology, and does that have any impact on how photogrammetry is going to work in the future? I was just thinking as you were talking, does RTI and photogrammetry, do they blend together technologically at some point, or do they now? So what's happening in the upcoming generations?
Yeah, a lot of the things you just said can already be done, or at least can be done in the research labs, even if they're not like out there all the time. So just to set the stage for a couple things looking back in time, photogrammetry, the idea of taking overlapping photos and using them for measurement, goes back to the 1850s. Okay, it's not a new idea. And the first photogrammetric society was in Prussia in the 1870s. So photogrammetry from airplanes with metric calibrated cameras was done a little bit in World War I. It was done heavily in World War II. In the 70s and 80s, this was done to create all the topo maps, like from the BLM and so forth. And then it's really been since the 2000s that the ability to do close range photogrammetry and not have to pre-calibrate everything and use all this expensive gear has become more and more and more accessible. Laser scanning systems have been around since the late 80s. And there isn't, I mean, they do what they do, and there hasn't been a huge change in laser scanning systems other than, I would say, the stuff that's going on for the self-driving cars. So there's really quick systems that do very, very low resolution, but can track like what's happening. So if you look at the LiDAR that's in like the latest iPhones, iPhone 12 and iPhone 13 Pro have a little LiDAR unit in them. You can't really scan directly with that. It's low resolution. What its primary purpose for putting it in there is for augmented reality. So if you have a situation where you point your camera, you move your camera around, and you want to see something placed in that scene, a 3D model or some other thing that you're placing in the scene, the camera can keep track of where you are. And Google and Google and Apple and other companies are taking advantage of all the research that's been happening around the self-driving cars to do that kind of stuff. There are some apps that can use the LiDAR along with photos to help with producing 3D models and 3D scanning. Those are right now, the ones that I'm aware of are all sort of proprietary black box. So you get something out of it, but you have no idea. Has it been smooth? Have holes been filled? What has happened to this? So yeah, I can see something that looks good, but from a research perspective, I have no ability to quantify it or understand exactly what I'm looking at. I think one of the reasons that we've really focused on computational photography is that that's an area where there's a huge amount of research. So there's a lot of work that's happening in computer vision and computer graphics around photography-based imaging. So we're seeing getting more and more data out of image sets, getting better precisions out of data, and ways that people are starting to combine some of these different techniques. So we do sometimes do RTI with photogrammetry. You can register one to the other. There's some advantages to it now. We can't fully integrate it, but that's something that I think could happen in the future. So, I mean, I think cameras are a great tool. So get one and learn how to use it, and you're going to be able to do more and more and more and more and more stuff with it.
One last question before we let you go, and this is a very high level question, I suppose, about the use. It seems to me that climate change, of course, we are recognizing it as an existential problem that is confronting a lot of museums and their own facilities, their collections, and especially like these heritage landscapes. What role do you see this computational photography playing in terms of just, possibly cataloging things that are at risk? Is this something that should be encouraged to really prioritize things that are at risk because of sea level rise, say, or flooding, or whatever the case might be, that might be lost?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, we talk about that all. I didn't talk about it in this presentation because we're focused on small museums, but that's a big driver for our work, and that's a big driver for why we think it's important to train lots of people to do this for themselves, because we need lots and lots of people to do this, to understand the trade-offs, and to get high quality data, and to also think about archiving and long-term reuse of the data. So climate change is a huge motivator for us to work in this space. And we just, it was just announced last week that we were awarded an NEH grant to do training with 3 indigenous communities. One is on the Passamaquoddy tribe in Northeast Maine. One is the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands Association, which is based in Anchorage. And one is Huliawapa'a in Hawaii. And part of why we're working with these 3 groups, they had all come to us about training, but they're all coastal and very much impacted by rising sea levels.
Yeah.
So the goal of this program is to buy some equipment for them and do 2 trainings plus online consulting to really get a program going to create a sustainable community of practice around high quality documentation of their cultural material. And these, I think, who knows why exactly this got funded, because anybody that's applied knows there's no guarantee. But I think that one of the compelling reasons to fund this project was because of the impact of climate change to these specific communities.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Carla. Very grateful for your comments. And of course, thank you all for being with us here today. Please remember to fill out an evaluation form and visit the community forum space at museum-hub.org. Hopefully we'll see you next week, same time, same place, for our final tech webinar for this module on 3D data applications in cultural heritage, presented by Harry Abramson of Direct Dimensions. Be well, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Take care.